And now, a passage from Henry Adams' History of the United States of America during the first administration of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1. Between Pennsylvania and Virginia stretched no barrier of mountains or deserts. Nature seemed to mean that the northern state should reach toward the Chesapeake and embrace its wide system of coasts and rivers. The Susquehanna, crossing Pennsylvania from north to south, rolled down wealth which in a few years built the city of Baltimore by the surplus of Pennsylvania's resources. Any part of Chesapeake Bay or of the streams which flowed into it was more easily accessible to Baltimore than any part of Massachusetts or Pennsylvania to New York. Every geographical reason argued that the Susquehanna, the Potomac, and the James should support one homogeneous people, yet the intellectual difference between Pennsylvania and Virginia was already more sharply marked than that between New England and the Middle States. The old Virginia society was still erect, priding itself on its resemblance to the society of England, which had produced Hampton and Chatham. The Virginia gentleman, wherever met, was a country gentleman or a lawyer among a society of planters. The absence of city life was the sharpest characteristic of Virginia, even compared with South Carolina. In the best and greatest of Virginians, the virtues which always stood in most prominence were those of the field and farm, the simple and straightforward mind, the notions of courage and truth, the absence of mercantile sharpness and quickness, the rusticity and open-handed hospitality, which could exist only where the struggle for life was hardly a struggle at all. No visitor could resist the charm of kindly sympathy which softened the asperities of Virginian ambition. Whether young Albert Gallatin went there, hesitating between Europe and America, or the still younger William Ellery Channing, with all New England on his active conscience, the effect was the same. "I blush for my own people," wrote Channing from Richmond in 1799, "when I compare the selfish prudence of a Yankee with the generous confidence of a Virginian. Here I find great vices, but greater virtues than I left behind me. There is one single trait which attaches me to the people I live with more than all the virtues of New England. They love money less than we do. They are more disinterested. Their patriotism is not tied to their purse strings. Could I only take from the Virginians their sensuality and their slaves, I should think them the greatest people in the world. As it is, with a few great virtues, they have innumerable vices." Even 40 years afterwards, so typical a New Englander as the poet Bryant acknowledged that whatever may be the comparison in other respects, the South certainly has the advantage over us in point of manners. Manners were not all their charm, for the Virginians at the close of the 18th century were inferior to no class of Americans in the sort of education then supposed to make refinement. The Duc de Liancourt bore witness. In spite of the Virginian love for dissipation, the taste for reading is commoner there among men of the first class than in any other part of America, but the populace is perhaps more ignorant there than elsewhere. Those whom Liancourt called men of the first class were equal to any standard of excellence known to history. Their range was narrow, but within it they were supreme. The traditions of high breeding were still maintained, and a small England, much as it existed in the time of the Commonwealth, was perpetuated in the Virginia of 1800. Social position was a birthright not merely of the well-born, but of the highly gifted. Nearly all the great lawyers of Virginia were of the same social stock as in New England. Poor and gifted men, welcomed into a landed aristocracy, simple in tastes and genial in temper. Chief Justice Marshall was such a man, commanding respect and regard wherever he was seen, perhaps most of all from New Englanders, who were least familiar with the type. George Mason was an ideal Republican, a character as strong in its way as Washington or Marshall. George Wythe, the Chancellor, stood in the same universal esteem, and even his young clerk Henry Clay, the mill boy of the Slashes, who had lately left Chancellor Wythe's office to set up one of his own at Lexington in Kentucky, inherited that Virginia geniality which, as it ripened with his years, made him an idol among northern and western multitudes who knew neither the source nor secret of his charm. Law and politics were the only objects of Virginian thought, but within these bounds the Virginians achieved triumphs. What could America offer in legal literature that rivaled the judicial opinions of Chief Justice Marshall? What political essay equaled the severe beauty of George Mason's Virginia Bill of Rights? What single production of an American pen reached the fame of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence? "The Virginians are the best orators I ever heard," wrote the young Channing, although Patrick Henry, the greatest of them all, was no longer alive. Everyone admitted that Virginia's society was ill at ease. In colonial days it rested on a few great props, the strongest being its close connection with England, and after this had been cut away by the Revolutionary War, primogeniture, the church, exemption of land from seizure for debt, and Negro slavery remained to support the oligarchy of planters. The momentum given by the Declaration of Independence enabled Jefferson and George Wythe to sweep primogeniture from the statute book. After an interval of several years, Madison carried the law which severed church from state. There the movement ended. All the great Virginians would gladly have gone on, but the current began to flow against them. They suggested a bill for emancipation, but could find no one to father it in the legislature, and they shrank from the storm it would excite. President Washington, in 1796, in a letter already quoted, admitted that land in Virginia was lower in price than land of the same quality in Pennsylvania. For this inferiority he suggested, among other reasons, the explanation that Pennsylvania had made laws for the gradual abolition of slavery, and he declared nothing more certain than that Virginia must adopt similar laws at a period not remote. Had the Virginians seen a sure prospect that such a step would improve their situation, they would probably have taken it. But the slave owners were little pleased at the results of reforms already effected, and they were in no humor for abolishing more of their old institutions. The effects of disestablishing the church were calculated to disgust them with all reform. From early times the colony had been divided into parishes, and each parish owned a church building. The system was the counterpart of that established in New England. The church lands, glebes, and endowments were administered by the clergymen, wardens, and vestry. Good society in Virginia recognized no other religion than was taught in this branch of English episcopacy. "Sure I am of one thing," was the remark in the Virginia legislature of an old-fashioned Federalist with powdered hair, three-cornered hat, long queue, and white-top boots. "Sure I am of one thing, that no gentleman would choose any road to heaven but the Episcopal." Every plantation was attached to a parish, and the earliest associations of every well-bred man and woman in Virginia were connected with the church service. In spite of all this, no sooner had Madison and his friends taken away the support of the state than the church perished. They argued that freedom of religion worked well in Pennsylvania and therefore must succeed in Virginia, but they were wrong. The Virginia gentry stood by and saw their churches closed, the roofs rot, the aisles and pews become a refuge for sheep and foxes, the tombstones of their ancestry built into strange walls or turned into flagging to be worn by the feet of slaves. By the year 1800, Bishop Madison found his diocese left so nearly bare of clergy and communicants that after a few feeble efforts to revive interest, he abandoned the struggle and contented himself with the humbler task of educating boys at the ancient College of William and Mary in the deserted colonial capital of Williamsburg. There the English traveler Weld visited him about the year 1797 and gave a curious picture of his establishment. "The bishop," he said, "is president of the college and has apartments in the buildings. Half a dozen or more of the students, the eldest about 12 years old, dined at his table one day that I was there. Some were without shoes or stockings, others without coats. During dinner they constantly rose to help themselves at the sideboard. A couple of dishes of salted meat and some oyster soup formed the whole of the dinner." Such a state of society was picturesque, but not encouraging. An aristocracy so lacking in energy and self-confidence was a mere shell to be crushed, as one might think, by a single vigorous blow. Nevertheless, Jefferson and Madison, after striking it again and again with the full force of revolutionary violence, were obliged to desist and turn their reforming axes against the church and hierarchy of New England. There they could do nothing but good, for the society of New England was sound, whatever became of the church or of slavery. But in Virginia the gap which divided gentry from populace was enormous, and another gap which seemed impassable divided the populace from the slaves. Jefferson's reforms crippled and impoverished the gentry, but did little for the people, and for the slaves nothing. Nowhere in America existed better human material than in the middle and lower classes of Virginians. As explorers, adventurers, fighters, wherever courage, activity, and force were wanted, they had no equals. But they had never known discipline and were beyond measure jealous of restraint. With all their natural virtues and indefinite capacities for good, they were rough and uneducated to a degree that shocked their own native leaders. Jefferson tried in vain to persuade them that they needed schools. Their character was stereotyped, and development impossible, for even Jefferson, with all his liberality of ideas, was Virginian enough to discourage the introduction production of manufactures and the gathering of masses in cities, without which no new life could grow. Among the common people, intellectual activity was confined to hereditary commonplaces of politics, resting on the axiom that Virginia was the typical society of a future Arcadian America. To escape the tyranny of Caesar by perpetuating the simple and isolated lives of their fathers was the sum of their political philosophy. To fix upon the national government the stamp of their own idyllic conservatism was the height of their ambition.